Summer 1955, Marfa, Texas, 110 degrees, flat, scorched earth stretching in every direction as far as the eye could see. No shade, no relief, no escape from the relentless West Texas sun that had been bearing down on this film crew for weeks and was beginning to teach everyone present exactly why nobody had ever attempted a major Hollywood production out here before. James Dean stood in the middle of it all in dusty work clothes, squinting into the white heat, and felt immediately at home. He had grown up on a farm in Indiana. He understood hard land and hard weather and the particular quality of silence that settles over flat country when the wind drops and everything goes still. He understood physical labor and the specific dignity of people who did it without complaint. And he understood, reading the script of Giant for the first time in the spring of 1955, that Jet Rink, the poor ranch hand who watches the privileged world pass him by for decades and then strikes oil beneath his feet and spends the rest of his life trying to fill the hole that poverty and humiliation had carved into him, was another character he would not need to invent from scratch. He already knew what it felt like to want more than the world was offering. He already knew what it felt like to be looked past, dismissed, treated as less than what you were by people who had decided what you were before you had a chance to show them anything different. He had been carrying that feeling since he was 9 years old, since a train platform in Santa Monica and a father who could not wait to be rid of him, and he had been putting it on screen in different forms ever since. Giant would be his third film, his last film, the most ambitious thing he had ever attempted, a sprawling Texas epic spanning 25 years of one man's life, requiring him to play a young drifter and then an aging, hollow, deeply bitter man who had gotten everything he wanted and found it meant nothing. Alongside two of the biggest stars Hollywood had ever produced. He had 6 months left to live. He did not know that. He got up every morning in the Texas heat, put on his dusty costume, and went to work. This is Episode 5, the last performance, the last friendship, the last drive. And September 30th, 1955, the afternoon that stopped America cold and made James Dean permanent forever. Giant was based on Edna Ferber's best-selling 1952 novel, a sweeping, multi-generational saga of a Texas ranching dynasty, the oil boom that transformed the state, and the complicated social landscape of race, class, and power that defined the American Southwest across the first half of the 20th century. Director George Stevens had spent years developing the adaptation, refining it, assembling the pieces carefully. By the spring of 1955, he had his cast: Rock Hudson, Elizabeth Taylor, and James Dean. Hudson was already one of the biggest stars in Hollywood, handsome, reliable, professionally polished in exactly the ways that Dean was not. He arrived on set prepared. He hit his marks. He delivered consistent, controlled performances and respected the established rhythms of a major studio production the way a craftsman respects the tools of his trade. He was, by every conventional measure, the consummate professional. Taylor was 23 years old and already a legend. Her beauty and talent and personal magnetism were so overwhelming that even the most seasoned people on any set she walked onto tended to rearrange themselves around her without quite realizing they were doing it. She had been acting since childhood. She knew every dimension of the industry, Brecht, its glamour and its cruelty and everything in between. And then there was Dean, 23 years old, intense and unpredictable and completely unimpressed by star power or studio hierarchy or any of the professional social structures that governed the way major Hollywood productions were supposed to run. The tension between Dean and Rock Hudson was immediate and genuine. Hudson found Dean's method approach self-indulgent and destabilizing. Dean would not give the same performance twice, would not hit the same emotional beats in the same way from take to take, would arrive on set having made decisions overnight that changed everything they had rehearsed. Hudson complained to director George Stevens directly and repeatedly. He said Dean was impossible to work with. He said the production was being held hostage to one actor's refusal to behave like a professional. Stevens listened to every complaint patiently and continued filming exactly as he had been. Because what Stevens was seeing in the dailies, the raw footage coming back from each day's shoot, screened each evening in a makeshift projection room in the middle of the Texas desert, was something that Hudson's considerable professionalism as real and He was seeing Jet Rink come alive on screen with a specificity and an emotional truth that went far beyond competent performance. Dean had found something in the character that was deeply, uncomfortably personal, the bitterness of a man who had wanted more than the world was willing to give him, who had finally gotten it through luck rather than through anyone choosing to recognize his worth, and who discovered that wealth and power had not filled the hole they were supposed to fill, that the wanting had been the point all along, and now that the wanting was over, there was nothing left but emptiness dressed in expensive clothes. That understanding was not invented. James Dean knew it from the inside, and the camera, as it always did with him, reached inside and found it. But if Rock Hudson found Dean difficult, Elizabeth Taylor found him something else entirely. Taylor was, by every account of everyone present on the giant set, the person on that production who understood James Dean most completely, and whom Dean, in turn, trusted most genuinely and completely. She was 23 years old, the same age as Dean, and she had been a professional actress since she was 9 years old. She knew from the deepest personal experience what it cost to grow up inside an industry that treated you as a commodity rather than a person. She knew the particular loneliness of being famous for your entire life and having almost no one around you who had known you before the fame arrived and could see past it to the actual human being living inside it. Dean and Taylor spent hours together between shots in the Texas heat, talking, laughing, sitting in the kind of companionable silence that only exists between people who have stopped needing to perform for each other. She did not need him to be James Dean, the movie star. He did not need her to be Elizabeth Taylor, the legend. They were two young people, profoundly lonely in ways that the outside world would never understand or believe, who had found each other in the middle of a flat and burning landscape and felt in each other's company briefly and genuinely less alone. Taylor later said that Dean was the most purely himself of any person she had ever encountered in Hollywood, that he had no capacity for the social performance that the industry ran on, no strategic charm, no careful management of how he was perceived, no gap between what he was feeling and what he showed. What you saw with James Dean was what was there, all of it, always, right at the surface with nothing between it and the world. That quality, she said, was what made him so extraordinary on screen. It was also, she admitted quietly, what made her worry about him. She saw something in him during those weeks in Marfa that she could not precisely name. A quality of living too fast, too fully, too close to the edge of everything, as though he was in a hurry he could not explain and did not entirely understand himself, as though some part of him knew, without knowing that he knew, that he was not going to have the time that other people had. She kept that worry to herself. She did not know what to do with it. None of them did. By the summer of 1955, James Dean had developed a consuming and increasingly dangerous passion for racing cars. It had begun as a general love of speed. Motorcycles, fast cars, anything that required total physical and mental presence to control and rewarded that presence with the sensation of pure, uncomplicated aliveness. But by mid-1955, it had become something more serious and more compulsive. He was entering professional racing competitions on weekends. He was spending significant money on faster machines. He talked about racing the way he talked about acting, not as a hobby or a diversion, but as a necessity, as one of the very few activities that made the relentless noise inside his head go completely quiet. In September 1955, he purchased a Porsche 550 Spyder, one of the fastest production cars available anywhere in the world at that time. Silver, featherlight, built specifically for racing circuits, not for the ordinary public highways of Central California. He had the number 130 painted on the doors. On the rear panel of the car, he had Dean, visibly excited about the new Porsche, invited Guinness outside after dinner to look at it. Guinness stood in the parking lot and examined the car carefully in the evening light. He felt, he said later, a sudden and completely irrational sense of dread that he could not explain or dismiss. He turned to Dean and told him directly and seriously, "Do not get into this car again." Something about it disturbed him in a way he could not articulate but could not ignore. He told Dean that if he drove that car, he would be dead within the week. Dean looked at him for a moment, then he laughed. He thanked Guinness for his concern, got into the Porsche, and drove away into the Los Angeles night. That conversation took place exactly 7 days before September 30th, 1955. The morning of September 30th, 1955 began like many mornings in James Dean's life that year, with a car and a road and somewhere to be. He was driving the Porsche north from Los Angeles to Salinas, California, where a racing event was scheduled for the following day. Rolf Wütherich, his German mechanic, and the person who knew the car better than anyone, was riding in the passenger seat. A friend followed behind in a separate vehicle pulling a trailer. Dean was in good spirits. He had recently received word that the early cut of Giant was extraordinary, that the footage of his performance was unlike anything George Stevens had seen from any actor in his long career. Warner Brothers was already talking seriously about awards. The most grueling shoot of his life was shaping up to be, by every indication reaching him, his greatest work. The future felt large and open in a way it had not always felt. He drove north through the San Fernando Valley and out into the open country beyond, the Porsche moving through the golden California afternoon with the easy, effortless speed it had been built for. The day was clear. The light was beautiful. He stopped for gas, ate something, kept moving. At around 3:15 p.m. on Route 466 near the small town of Cholame, a California Highway Patrol officer pulled the Porsche over. Dean was doing 65 miles per hour in a 55 zone. The officer issued a citation. Dean signed it politely, handed it back, waited for the officer to pull away, and then eased back onto the highway. 15 minutes later, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, at the intersection of Route 466 and Route 41, a 23-year-old college student named Donald Turnipseed was driving a 1950 Ford Tudor sedan in the opposite direction. Turnipseed began a left turn across the highway. He said later that he did not see the Porsche coming. He may not have had time to see it. The Porsche was traveling at approximately 85 miles per hour when it entered the intersection. The collision lasted less than a second. Rolf Wütherich was thrown clear of the wreckage and survived, badly injured. Donald Turnipseed walked away with minor injuries. James Dean remained in the car. He was pulled from the wreckage and transported by ambulance to Paso Robles War Memorial Hospital, where he was pronounced dead at 5:59 p.m. The cause of death was a broken neck and multiple severe internal injuries sustained on impact. He was 24 years old. The speeding ticket he had signed 15 minutes before the crash was recovered from the wreckage of the Porsche. The words, "Little Bastard," were still legible on the twisted rear of the car. The news reached Hollywood within hours. Elizabeth Taylor collapsed when she heard it. She had to be sedated by a doctor. She would say in interviews for the rest of her long and eventful life, through 8 marriages and extraordinary triumphs and devastating losses of her own, that September 30th, 1955 was one of the days that divided everything into before and after. That there was a world which contained James Dean and a world which did not, and that the second world was permanently and measurably diminished by his absence from it. Nicholas Ray heard the news and sat alone in his editing room for hours without speaking. George Stevens, who had spent months watching Dean build Jet Rink into something extraordinary in the Texas heat, received the call and went very quiet, in the way that people go quiet when the loss is too large for immediate response. Warner Brothers, which had 2 unreleased Dean films in post-production, which had been planning his career arc for the next decade, which had seen in this strange and difficult and absolutely irreplaceable young man the future of everything they were building, went into a silence that lasted days before the business of managing the situation could begin. And across America, in cities and suburbs and small towns and farms, the teenagers who had seen East of Eden and were waiting for Rebel Without a Cause to open in something that had only just arrived, something that had given you, for the first time, a face and a voice for the thing you had been feeling alone in the dark. He was gone. He was 24 years old. He had made 3 films. He had been the most talked about young actor in America for exactly 8 months. And he was already eternal. Giant was released on October 10th, 1956, more than a year after James Dean died. He had not seen a single frame of the finished film. The performance earned him his second Academy Award nomination for Best Actor. Both of his nominations are Bowie Borimko 8, for East of Eden and for Giant, Richie Poirot, were posthumous. He remains the only actor in the history of the Academy Awards to receive 2 posthumous nominations for Best Actor. He never won. The nominations were the industry's formal acknowledgement of what everyone who had watched him work already knew: that the boy from Fairmount, Indiana had been, in his brief and blazing passage through Hollywood, something that defied category and resisted replacement and refused, even in death, to be forgotten. The world he left behind was not finished with him. Episode 6, The Mourning. 8,000 letters a month arriving at Warner Brothers addressed to a dead man, a generation that refused to let him go, and the birth of something entirely new in American culture, the myth of the forever young. This is Legends of America. Think about what September 30th, 1955 actually took. Not just a young man, not just an actor with 2 films released and 1 in the editing room. What it took was the next 40 years of American cinema that James Dean would have made. The films that would never exist, the performances that would never be captured, the roles that would have been written specifically for him, shaped around that particular quality he possessed, that wound that never closed, that absolute refusal to hide what was real, and that now would never be filled by anyone else because there was no one else who could fill them. Hollywood spent years trying to find the next James Dean. It never did. It never could. Because what Dean had was not a technique that could be studied and reproduced. It was a specific human life, lived in a specific way that produced a specific quality of truth on screen. You cannot manufacture that. You cannot train for it. You can only recognize it when it appears and hope you have the camera pointed in the right direction. The 65-plus audience watching this video right now was there. You were teenagers when September 30th, 1955 happened. You remember what it felt like to hear that news, the specific, bewildering grief of losing someone who had only just arrived, who had only just given you a language for something you had been feeling alone for years, who had only just made you feel seen. That grief never fully resolved. It wasn't supposed to. Some losses stay with you not because you failed to heal, but because the thing you lost was genuinely irreplaceable. James Dean was genuinely irreplaceable. And you have always known it. Episode 6 is next.